Today, 23rd June, is the day following the anniversary for Russians of the German attack on the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941. If for Americans 7th December 1941 is the day that will live in infamy, being the day, of course, when Japan attacked the United States naval base in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. 22nd June 1941 is far more than that for the Russians. It was, of course, the beginning of what was the most intense and fiercely fought and bloody war in human history. Now, the Russians, every Russian family, of course, suffered losses, casualties in that war, and the official figure for dead that the Soviet Union experienced over the course of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, as the Russians call it, the official figure stands at 27 million. Now, to get a sense of what that means, I understand that the estimates, the best estimates for the size of the Soviet population on the eve of the Second World War, it was 170 million. 170 million people in the Soviet Union on the 21st of June 1941. When the war ended, and it's important to say that for the Soviet Union as well as for other countries, the war actually ended in September 1945 with the surrender of Japan. The Soviet Union was involved in a major battle against Japan in August 1941. But when the war ended, assuming that this figure of 170 million that's given for the Soviet population on the eve of the war is correct, well, the Soviet population would then have fallen to 143 million. 170 million before the war, 143 million after the Second World War. Now, when people talk about casualties on this scale, I have to say, first of all, that it's very difficult to imagine them. But I think it's also very difficult for people who have not experienced a disaster on this scale to understand fully what the effect must be on the society that suffers it. Even though the Soviets achieved their victory, the population, Soviet population, would have known people, every single Soviet citizen would have known people that failed to survive the war within their own families. That, by the way, includes the Soviet leader himself, Joseph Stalin, one of whose sons died in the Second World War in German captivity. Now, what the effect of all of this death and destruction was on Soviet decision-making in the immediate years after the Second World War has never, I think, been properly judged or assessed. I'm not even sure whether people fully know whether the Soviet leaders themselves, after the Second World War, fully grasped the extent of the disaster, the devastation, and the death that their country had suffered. In the immediate years after the Second World War and throughout the period of Stalin's remaining rule, the Soviets would only admit to 7 million deaths, and I believe it was in the 1960s that they finally acknowledged a death toll of 20 million, and the official figure today of 27 million was only finally acknowledged in the last years of the Soviet Union. So whether, as I said, Stalin himself and the people around him fully understood in the 1940s how terrible the price their country had paid for its victory in the Second World War was. I admit I simply do not know whether the Soviet officials, when they were saying that the losses were only 7 million as opposed to the 27 million, whether they were simply lying or whether they generally didn't know. And as I said, what effect this had on their decisions, I absolutely do not know. But I cannot help but think that a lot of the policy decisions they made in the 1940s and 1950s must have been heavily influenced and shaped by their own personal experiences and that of their country in the Second World War. And I would add that, again, I think Western commentators, historians and experts who talk about the development of the Soviet Union after the Second World War, Soviet policies after the end of the Second World War, the events that caused the Soviet Union's eventual collapse, also do not properly factor in the effects of the devastation that the Second World War caused. It would be true to say that in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, Soviet society appeared to be on an upswing. Economic growth was high. Living standards grew. To all appearances, the country was full of self-confidence. But I suspect that below the surface, all kinds of problems affect, if you like, of the post-traumatic stress disorder that Soviet society must have collectively felt as a result of the Second World War. And the social crisis that began to emerge in Soviet society in the late 1960s and 1970s as the generation that had lived through the war began to reach middle and old age. Well, again, I suspect that all of this is underestimated and undervalued in the West. And again, there's little understanding of the degree to which this experience, which was an experience that all the leaders of the country shared, the extent to which it shaped their policy decisions as well. And if we go right up to date, it remains the case that today Russian political decision-making, to a degree which I think Westerners failed to appreciate, specifically, for example, in connection with the conflict in Ukraine, also continues to be affected by memories of the Second World War. Consider a ceremony that took place in the Kremlin, for example, on the eve of the commemorations of the anniversary of the German attack. Putin and Belousov, the new defense minister, addressed military cadets in the St. George's Hall in the Kremlin. Now, I'm not going to devote any time to what they said, which was very much the sort of things you would expect them to say at a ceremony like that. But having said that, what they did say also harked back to that earlier conflict, the one that Russia lived through during the Second World War. And I also cannot fail but point out that one of the iconic events in Russian and Soviet history leading up to the events of 22nd June 1941 was a similar meeting that the Soviet leaders, including Joseph Stalin, had with Soviet military cadets. I believe it was in May 1941, shortly before the start of the Second World War, where, according to reports, and I believe this is now confirmed by the official transcript of Stalin's speech, basically the cadets were warned that war was coming and that the country would go through great trials, and the burden of enduring those trials would fall on them. So, again, I read lots of articles, lots of commentaries in the West about Russian policy, about the expansionist and aggressive intentions of the Russian leaders. I see absolutely no evidence that Russian leaders actually have any of those aggressive intentions at all. In fact, they have repeatedly denied that they have, and they've denied that they have in the discussions and speeches that they make to themselves. But what I do see is evidence of a country whose leadership feels itself embattled and which sees a constant pattern of Western pressure on Russia, of which, of course, the single most terrible and terrifying event was the Second World War, which began on the 22nd of June, 1941. Anyway, I just wanted to make these points. I'm going to return to perspectives on Soviet history later in this program, touching on an interesting article written by the British academic and historian Niall Ferguson. But anyway, let's now return to the conflict in Ukraine, always understanding that for Russians, for the leadership of Russia, for the men in the Kremlin, the men and women in the Kremlin, because there are, of course, women there now. Anyway, for them, they see it very much as a sequel and epilogue, if you like, to the events of the Second World War, the ones that for the Russians really began in earnest on the 22nd of June, 1941. So let's now return to what's going on in the conflict, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. And as night follows day, we learn that the Ukrainians are now badgering the Americans for permission to use ATACMS missiles for deep strikes inside Russia. Now, I said that this would happen when the United States announced its change of policy a few weeks ago, when it said that it would allow cross-border strikes by the Ukrainians using American weapons into Russia. The United States at that time appeared to acknowledge the existence of Russian red lines, the fact that Putin had given clear warnings against using long-range missiles, American long-range missiles, ATACMS missiles, to conduct deep strikes inside Russia. The United States appeared to acknowledge that. It said that the only permission that Ukraine had been given was for attacks, shelling and rocket strikes in the immediate area of the border. But I said that it was only a question of time before the Ukrainians came back and demanded more, and the Americans came under pressure to agree to more. And of course there are some, in fact many American officials and many West European officials, European officials, who hanker to give the Ukrainians that permission to do more. And we now learn from the Associated Press that this is what has now come. So this is the article by Samia Kolar in the Associated Press, which appeared yesterday. Significantly, 22nd of June 2024, in other words, on the actual anniversary of the German attack on the Soviet Union. Anyway, here is the article. I'm not going to read it all, but the title reads, "As US-supplied weapons show impact inside Russia, Ukrainian soldiers hope for deeper strikes." And we're told that weeks after the decision allowing Ukraine to use US-supplied weapons for limited strikes in Russian territory, the country is having some success in halting Russia's new push along the northeast front, but military commanders are clamoring for restrictions on long-range missiles to be lifted. Deteriorating battlefield conditions force the US to permit Ukraine to use Western-supplied artillery and rocket systems to defend the eastern city of Kharkiv by targeting border regions where the Kremlin's forces assemble and launch attacks. The impact was swift. Ukrainian forces pushed Russian positions back one time to better fortify their own positions and even mounted small offensive actions. None of that is true, by the way, but we'll come to that in a moment. But commanders said that without the ability to use long-range guided missiles, such as ATACMS, their hands are tied. We could target Russian brigade command posts and the entire northern grouping because they are located 100 to 150 kilometers from the front line, said Hephaestus, an artillery commander in Kharkiv region who goes by his call sign. Normal ammunition can't get at them. With this kind, we can do a lot to destroy their centers of command. And of course, the pressure is now on, and it's only a matter of time, as I said, before the Americans give that permission. They've always acceded to every request for escalation that comes from the Ukrainians. And we're told that Ukrainian officials are pushing US allies to be able to strike particular high-value targets inside Russia using ATACMS, which can reach over 100 kilometers. Unfortunately, we still cannot reach, for example, airfields and their aircraft. This is the problem. Yegor Cherniev, Deputy Chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on National Security, Defense and Intelligence, said earlier this month. That's why we are asking allies to lift the restrictions to use long-range missiles against limited military targets in the territory of Russia. And we're told that the permission that's already been given is not a panacea, but the move has greatly slowed Russia's momentum, even allowing Ukrainian troops to make advances along the northeast border, recently recapturing areas southwest of Vozdvyzhenka, according to local reports. Except I've not seen any evidence that the Ukrainians have in fact captured any areas southwest of Vozdvyzhenka. I'm not going to dwell on that. So there it is. Ukrainians want the Americans to let them cross, this time, an actual Russian red line. A red line that Putin has already warned should not be crossed, and of which he has said that the Russians reserve the right to take counter-action, including counter-strikes on territories, NATO territories, or against facilities of NATO countries, including, by the way, the Americans themselves, anywhere in the world. Now, let's just quickly dispose of some of the comments that are made here. We're told that the original permission to allow cross-border strikes into Russia was the consequence of deteriorating battlefield conditions, and that this was done in order to defend the eastern city of Kharkiv, except that the Russians have said that they do not plan to capture Kharkiv, that their plan is to establish a sanitary zone along the border, the Russian border, in light of Ukrainian attacks on their own territory. Now, one can be cynical if one wishes about what the Russians say, but when Group of Forces North staged its incursion into Kharkiv region, it did so with a force which initially numbered perhaps 12,000 men, has now increased to 25,000 men, according to most reports, out of a total grouping that numbers around 50,000 men, and a whole army of Western commentators, Western military commentators in particular, were telling us at the time that this was not enough troops to capture Kharkiv. But here we see, suddenly, a couple of weeks later, that the Ukrainians are saying, and Associated Press is reporting, that despite the Russian denials and the observations by the Western military commentators that the Russians were not strong enough with the forces they had to capture Kharkiv, that in fact it was all about defending the city of Kharkiv. And then we're told that the Ukrainians have stabilized the situation and have even regained ground. We'll come to that in a moment, but I get to say straight away that I see absolutely no evidence of that at all, nor have I seen any real evidence that the Russians have in fact been stopped. In fact, the very latest evidence suggests that in Volchansk specifically, the Russians are still advancing. But anyway, notwithstanding the fact that the situation is said to have stabilized and that the American permission to use these weapons in the way that they were used has actually achieved its intended purpose, which is to save the city of Kharkiv, which of course was never threatened, but let's put that aside. Notwithstanding that the permission achieved, or so we're told, its purpose, the Ukrainians want even more. They want to be able to use American missiles to strike deep inside Russian territory. And they justify that by saying that they need to do that in order to be able to hit, with ATACMS missiles, the brigade headquarters, the airfields, to strike deep inside Russia. This whole article, if you take a step back and think what it says, it is shot full of contradictions. But of course, it's contradictions of the sort that you would expect when a decision has been made, which I think fundamentally, in principle, it has been made, to violate Russian red lines, to cross Russian red lines. You start by saying that it's only to carry out attacks across the border, but then you say it's not enough. You need to attack even deeper, even though you're not really explaining why. Why you need to do this incredibly dangerous and provocative thing if, as you say, what you were intending to do by the initial step you took, even though you say that that initial step was successful. But there it is. Now, let's actually turn to what is happening in Kharkiv region, putting aside the things that the Ukrainians are saying and the Associated Press is repeating. First of all, Ukraine has indeed launched various counterattacks in the Lipsy area and in the Volchansk area, and there's been much talk about a Ukrainian offensive in this area. But up to now, at least for the moment, that these counterattacks appear to have failed. Now let's start, first of all, with what Group of Forces North tells us. This is their latest report, the one that they published yesterday. In the Volchansk area, fierce fighting continues in Volchansk. During the day, our artillery thwarted one attempt to transfer Ukrainian reserves, destroying up to 5 men. The enemy did not make any more such attempts. In the east of the city, we disrupted the rotation of the 36th Army Brigade by dense artillery fire and use of TOS-1 flamethrower tanks. The 2nd Battalion of the 36th Army Brigade has lost more than 250 men, killed and wounded, and has had to be withdrawn from the front in order to restore its combat effectiveness. Realizing its powerlessness, the enemy attacked our positions with the help of drones with chemical weapons. Well, let's put that aside. That's what the Russians say. I've not seen any evidence for that at all. The Russians have made those claims in the past. I've not seen enough proof that it's happened, so I'm not going to discuss this in further detail. And anyway, Group of Forces North then goes on to say in the Lipsy direction, Russian aviation continued to destroy the deployment points of the 13th and 3rd Brigades of the National Guard of Ukraine. These are not, in other words, military units that the Ukrainians are deploying in this area. They are National Guards units of the force, an internal security force, but one which the Ukrainians are increasingly deploying to the battlefield. Over the day, the defeat of at least 2 was confirmed. So deployment points of the 13th and 3rd Brigades of the National Guards of Ukraine, and the Russians say that 2 of these units were defeated. I'm not quite sure what that means precisely, but anyway, that's what they say. In the vicinity of the village of Gluporka, we repelled another Ukrainian attack of up to 15 men, supported by 2 armoured personnel carriers. The enemy's losses amounted to 6 men killed and 1 BTR-4E, this is a Ukrainian armoured personnel carrier, was destroyed. Over the past 24 hours, enemy losses amounted to 250 men. And then there's a list of armoured vehicles that the Russians say were destroyed, and artillery pieces and all sorts of things. And then Group of Forces North continues as follows. As expected, seeing no chance of defeating us on the battlefield, the Kiev regime's army has begun using dirty methods of warfare. That refers to the chemical weapons, presumably. And then it says that in addition to using cluster munitions, today the enemy used Terrain 6 gas on our positions. I believe that's a kind of tear gas. It's not, in other words, as far as I'm aware, a prohibited weapon. And then it goes on to say, we were prepared for this and had personal protective equipment. With such actions, the Ukrainian command only confirms its incompetence and inability to achieve success, even by such despicable methods. Zelensky's generals must realize that no authorization to use Western weapons will help them, and the collapse of their regime is near. Victory will be ours. So, what is happening? Well, we can supplement this report from Group of Forces North with more reports that we've been receiving from the battlefronts. There are now more reports from Ukrainian soldiers that the aggregate plant has indeed been fully captured by the Russians. The Ukrainian General Staff is denying this, but apparently Ukrainian soldiers in the area effectively admit that the aggregate plant has indeed come under Russian control. The Russians have apparently, therefore, successfully completed their encirclement of the men, the Ukrainian troops of the 71st Jaeger Brigade, who are holed up in the area of the high-rise buildings, the so-called citadel, immediately to the north of the aggregate plant. Now, the Russians in this report do not give information about advances in the Volchansk area, but again, there are reports, which are probably true, that the Russians have finally cleared the Ukrainians completely from the forested area in the loop of the Volcha River, immediately to the south of the aggregate plant, where the Ukrainians were previously located. And the Russians, the group of forces north, tell us that Ukrainian attempts to send reinforcements to the northern area of Volchansk have essentially been abandoned. One attempt was made, but it was repelled, and 5 Ukrainian soldiers were killed, though we're not told how many Ukrainian troops did in fact try to cross the river to try to relieve the men of the 71st Brigade. And Group of Forces North tell us that the attempts by the Ukrainians to break through on the eastern flanks of Volchansk, the Russians' eastern flanks of northern Volchansk, were unsuccessful as well. So it looks as if the trap around the men of the 71st Brigade has now closed. By the way, we have stopped receiving reports for some time from the Ukrainians that they have allegedly trapped the Russian troops on the territory of the aggregate plant. So that's the situation as Group of Forces North describes it. Let's go back to that article by Associated Press. They say that they have stabilized the situation, but they need to conduct strikes deep inside Russia. I would suggest that what this article in Associated Press is telling us is that those claims that the situation in Kharkiv region has stabilized are simply wrong. That the Ukrainians have been contacting the United States, begging for permission to use ATACMS missiles to strike deep inside Russia for 2 reasons. Firstly, because the aggregate plant has almost certainly fallen, and the men of the 71st Brigade are trapped, and an entire battalion of the 36th Marine Brigade, which was sent to relieve the Ukrainian troops in Volchansk, has been in effect destroyed. And so the Ukrainians want to try to stabilize the situation, as they believe, by launching deep strikes against Russian positions using these ATACMS missiles. I think the other reason, and notice the specific reference to airfields, is because the Ukrainians in this area are now terrified about the effect of Russian use of the new Fab 3000 bombs. These bombs have been tested by the Russians in the Lipsy area. The Russians have dropped several of these bombs now, but they've not been used in vast quantities. there's some claims, Military Summary Channel has been repeating them, that only 2 Sukhoi 34s have been adapted to drop these bombs, which is consistent, by the way, with what you would expect when an entirely new system has been introduced into the battle. Firstly, you test it out on the battlefield in a limited way, find out whether there are any problems. Then, after those problems have been ironed out, then you distribute the technology more widely, and you train the pilots, you instruct the pilots who fly the Sukhoi 34s as to how these bombs should be used, the various techniques in operating them, the altitudes, the speeds the aircraft should use, things of that kind, the distance of the targets, things of that kind. And there's been some comment about the fact that the bombs have not hit exactly some of the buildings that they appear to be aimed at. And then this is exactly, again, what you would expect of bombs that are, for the first time, being used in battlefield conditions. I remember when the Fab 500s and Fab 1500s were first used last year. Again, their accuracy was not complete, but it steadily improved to the point where they can now be used in the most precise way, so that, for example, during the Battle of Avdiivka, the Russians were able to drop hundreds of Fab bombs on Ukrainian positions in Avdiivka every day during the last period of the fighting, with some of these strikes taking place just a few meters, 100 meters or so, from the Russian positions. So with a much bigger bomb like the Fab 3000, you need even greater accuracy and even greater understanding of its effect. And it's understandable, therefore, that the Russians are still tweaking its use. But the bombs that have been dropped do seem to have fallen very close, almost exactly next to their targets. They seem to be causing devastation on their targets when they do fall. One gets the sense that any problems with their use are not major, and that the Russians almost certainly will be able to iron them out within the next couple of weeks. And though only 2 Sukhoi 34s have allegedly been adapted to use these bombs for the moment, which is what you would expect if, as I said, they're being tested in battle rather than used in volume terms, well, the Russians have lots of other Sukhoi 34s that could be adapted to carry these bombs also. Now, according to the last piece of information that I got, as of the start of this year, Russia fielded around 165 Sukhoi 34s. Since then, to my knowledge, there's been at least one batch, perhaps 2 batches, of Sukhoi 34s that have been supplied by the Russian air defense aircraft building industry. I don't know, nobody knows, exactly how many aircraft make up a batch, perhaps 6 or 12. It could be, therefore, that the Russians have anywhere between 160 and 180 Sukhoi 24s. If just 10 or even 20 of them were adapted to drop Fab 3000 bombs, that would have a devastating effect on any Ukrainian positions that the Russians decided to strike at. So we can see the sudden urgency in the demands to use ATACMS missiles against the Russian air bases. The idea is carry out limited strikes on air bases. That's the way it's been packaged. Attacks on airfields and military infrastructure in Russia's deep rear, so that the Russians aren't able to use the Fab 3000s on the battlefronts. It is an impossible thing to do. The Ukrainians are asking for permission to do something that simply cannot be done. Yes, ATACMS missiles can be brought closer to the front lines and can be launched against Russian targets further deep inside Russia, but they have a range of supposedly around 200 to 300 kilometers. So if they were indeed to strike at targets within Russia at distances of 150 to 200 kilometers from the Russian border, they would need to be brought within 50 perhaps kilometers of the Russian border. Except, of course, that the Russians are not positioned on the border itself. There's some distance from the border now, and besides they have vast fleets of drones, including suicide drones, Lancets and such things. And if HIMARS launch systems were deployed with ATACMS missiles so close to the Russian border in Kharkiv region, well, it would be a devastating disaster for those HIMARS launchers. The Russians would go hunting them and would almost certainly quickly destroy them, just as they quickly destroyed the air defense systems, the Patriots and the S-300s that were also deployed earlier in the war close to the border as well. And the Russian air defense system has, as I have repeatedly pointed out, shown that it can shoot down ATACMS missiles. And one must assume that in a territory like Kharkiv region, Russian radar coverage is going to be even more dense than it is, for example, in an area like Crimea. The Russians have far better abilities to deploy radars and advanced systems in Belgorod and Kursk and Bryansk region than they do in Crimea itself, because of the communications, the ease of communications. And of course they have over-the-horizon radars and all those sort of things. And it's debatable whether the Ukrainians would be able to penetrate the Russian air defences with ATACMS missiles and really inflict damage on Russian airfields to anything like the level that has been suggested. Now, the Ukrainians have been conducting lots of big drone strikes across Russia in recent days. There was a huge one across Krasnodar region, for example, with a few drones apparently doing, I'm going to say it, minor damage to some Russian oil refining facilities, but it doesn't seem as if any significant damage was done. But there's been suggestions made, including in Russia itself, that these drone strikes are not for real, that their purpose is to try to deplete the Russian air defences in order to open the way for the ATACMS missiles to launch their deep strikes. This is to misunderstand the way in which the Russian air defense system works. Firstly, as I understand it, the primary defense against drones are not surface-to-air missiles or cannons or anything of that sort. They are electronic warfare devices of which the Russians appear to have an enormous profusion. That is the first principal defense against Ukrainian drones, these drones that the Ukrainians have been sending into Russia. And when the electronic warfare systems fail, the drones are destroyed not by the big, powerful Russian surface-to-air missiles, the S-400s and the S-300s and the S-350s and the Books and all of those, which are the ones that would be initially used to bring down the ATACMS missiles, but by point defense systems. Systems like the Panzer, which probably principally uses high-velocity cannon to shoot down the drones, and which is supplemented by relatively simple missiles, which can be launched against drones with fairly high levels of effectiveness, apparently, but which are easy to produce in quantity. It is impossible to deplete the Russian air defences in this way. Saying that that is what these drone attacks is about is to misunderstand the way in which the Russians operate a layered air defence system. So the other problem with launching ATACMS missiles in this area would be, of course, that not only would the Russians be able to probably track these missiles with their radars, their ground radars, and for all I know, there are AWACS aircraft in this area also. But beyond the ability to shoot them down with surface-to-air defences and electronic warfare defences, the Russians could also shoot down ATACMS missiles, almost certainly using their fighter jets in exactly the way that US fighter jets shot down Iranian missiles during the Iranian missile strike on the Iranian missile strike on Israel a few weeks ago. So this is not a plan that is going to succeed, and since it cannot succeed, there is no logic in crossing Russian red lines and taking on the terrible risks which go with that by authorizing the Ukrainians to conduct these ATACMS strikes on Russian facilities deep inside Russia. Yet that is precisely what I predict is going to happen. For no real ultimate gains, obviously one or two or a few ATACMS missiles will get through and will do a certain amount of damage, but nowhere near enough to make an actual difference in the situation on the battlefronts. For no real substantive gain, a Russian red line is going to be crossed, creating all of the risks and dangers of escalation that I and many others have spoken about at such great length over the course both of my programs and any number of articles and programs that others have done. It is the height of foolishness. It is complete strategic folly, but that, I suspect, has been in effect the plan all along. Eventually, I am sure, those who took the decision to supply Ukraine with these missiles, the ATACMS missiles, intended that they would be used against targets inside Russia. And these people who had that intention always prevail in whatever political or bureaucratic battle takes place over questions of escalation in Washington. So that is where we're going. We're going towards an escalation which, in battle terms, will achieve nothing, which, according to Ukraine's own logic, makes no sense. They claim that they've stabilized the situation in Kharkiv region. They're not being honest about that, but that is what they say. And yet they claim that they need this further extraordinary escalation. And the tone and language and of the article by Associated Press, as I said, all but confirms that there are people in Washington who are not just sympathetic to them, but, in my opinion, egging the Ukrainians along. Well, all that this is going to do, in my opinion, is that once the Russians have seen off whatever offensive the Ukrainians cobbled together in the Kharkiv region, and by the way, I'm confident that behind the scenes, the other argument that is being made is that Ukraine needs to conduct these deep strikes inside Russia in order to support this offensive that the Ukrainians intend to launch in this area. Well, all that it's going to do, once this offensive is out of the way, is that in this particular area of the battlefronts, it will incentivize the Russians to advance even further than they had perhaps initially intended to go, perhaps committing more troops to this area than perhaps they had initially intended, and with the Ukrainian offensive repulsed and defeated, to go on the attack, and who knows, perhaps to capture Kharkiv also. And of course, in saying all of that, I'm not even discussing the further escalatory measures that the Russians will take, and which they have said they will take, if permission, to use cruise missiles to carry out deep strikes on Russian territory, if that permission is finally given. Here we see the incredibly bad decision-making process in the United States, where one gets the sense that decisions are being made by a tiny group of people in the National Security Council and the State Department, who give advice to the president without perhaps thinking through the implications of what they're proposing, and without perhaps seeking broader advice from the expert community, which in this case is the US military. Anyway, we spent enough time talking about this and about the situation in Volchansk. Let's talk about the situation elsewhere on the battlefields. And here we see that the situation goes from bad to worse for Ukraine. The Ukrainians may be talking about an offensive in Kharkiv region, and by the way, in relation to the offensive in Kharkiv region and to the possible use of the ATACMS, before I finally drop that subject, I would just point to the comment that group of forces north has made. Zelensky's generals must realize that no authorization to use Western weapons will help them, and the collapse of their regime is near. That's clearly a reference to the possible use of ATACMS missiles in this area. The Russians are ready for them, and they know how to deal with them, and they're basically giving that warning. But anyway, let's move on to what's going on elsewhere on the battlefronts. Even as the Ukrainians, the Americans remain obsessed with Kharkiv region, everywhere else, the situation is deteriorating, and it is deteriorating very fast. Now, we've had some pictures from the Rabotino-Verbovoye area. I don't want to dwell on this, but it now seems clear that the Russians have effectively reached their old defense lines and are now proceeding to occupy them, and they're no doubt reseeding the minefields that they created in this area themselves. If there is an intention by the Ukrainians to conduct another offensive in the Zaporozhye area, it will fail every bit as disastrously as the earlier one did. The Russians are now much stronger. The Ukrainians are weaker. The Surovikin line was never dented. There's no reason to think it will be broken by any new attack that a weakened and disorganized Ukrainian army can mount in this area. Anyway, just to say, that's the news from Rabotino. There's further news that the Russians have now cleared the Ukrainians of the last of the high-rise buildings in Krasnogorovka. All that is left now is the low buildings in the suburbs, the small one-story, two-story cottages and villas that you find in the outskirts of some Soviet-era towns. It's suggested that the ability of the Ukrainians to defend themselves in this territory is probably limited, with the Russians now in full control of the high-rise buildings. As I said, the Russians have been taking their time in the Krasnogorovka area. But one area where they have not been taking their time, and the place, one of the three places where they're now attacking the Ukrainians very, very hard, is in the area of Ocheretino. And here we have reports that the Russians have now advanced northwards from the village of Novo-Alexandrovka, which all reports on the front lines, Russian and Ukrainian, say that the Russians have captured, though the fact has not yet been confirmed by the Russian Defense Ministry. But anyway, that the Russians have advanced north from the village of Novo-Alexandrovka, and that they have now begun storming the village of Vozdvyzhenka. And Vozdvyzhenka is the last settlement before the Russians reach the road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka, this critical supply road. If the Russians capture Vozdvyzhenka, the road in effect is cut. There is nothing else, no other place where the Ukrainians can defend it. And with the road cut, that will presumably enable the Russians to it will enable the Russians to stop the flow of supplies from Pokrovsk towards the Ukrainian garrisons in Toretsk and New York, but it will also complicate the supply to Chasiv Yar, the Ukrainian grouping in Chasiv Yar, and it will make the Ukrainians perhaps overly dependent on supplying their forces from the north, from Kramatorsk, where apparently the supply lines are already overloaded. So, the attack on Vozdvyzhenka is apparently extremely consequential, and we will see what happens. Most probably, the Ukrainians will try to defend Vozdvyzhenka as long as they can, but it's clear that they're now desperately short of reserves, and such reserves as they have, they've redeployed to the Kharkiv region, where apparently their Western allies are insisting that they must carry out an offensive. And in precisely this area, in the area of Novo-Alexandrovka, the Russians are enlarging their area of control. Now, there's been lots of reports about a village called Sokol, which lies to the west of Ocheretino. And there were reports that were appearing about a week ago that the Russians have actually captured Sokol. It seems that those reports were premature, that most of the fighting was not taking place in Sokol itself, that they were taking place in a major fortified position that the Ukrainians had created just north of this village of Sokol. And this was a fortified position that lay between Sokol and Novo-Alexandrovka. Now, this is where it all in some ways becomes interesting, because in the past we've been hearing a great deal about the so-called Zelensky line, the network of defences that the Ukrainians created from Vuhledar in the south all the way through Avdiivka, through Krasnogorovka, through Marinka, Krasnogorovka, Avdiivka, Toretsk, Chasov Yar, Bakhmut. This was the Zelensky line, which the Russians came up against in the summer of 2022. Now, the Zelensky line has now essentially collapsed. The Russians captured Bakhmut, one of the key positions in the Zelensky line, in May 2023. They captured Marinka in December. They captured Avdiivka in February. They're now capturing, or in the process of capturing, Krasnogorovka as well. So the Ukrainians are in effect now falling back to an earlier line of fortifications, which was created during the presidency of the former President Poroshenko, and which some therefore are calling the Poroshenko line. And this fortified position between the villages of Sokol and Novo-Alexandrovka apparently was a part of the Poroshenko line. And it has just been captured. So the Russians have captured one of the defences that used to make up the original line of defence that the Ukrainians had in Donbass, going back perhaps to the 2014, the early stages of the 2014 fighting. It has now come under their control. And with the capture of this fortified position, the Russians are in a position to sweep through Sokol, which will presumably, the announcement of its capture will probably come within the next couple of days. And apparently the Russians are also in the process of storming the next village immediately to the west of Sokol, called Yevgenivka. Now, the reason I think that the Russians are attacking these places is because since they're advancing northward from Novo-Alexandrovka to Vozdvyzhenka, they want to make sure that they're not going to be threatened by a Ukrainian attack on their flanks, and the capture of this important fortified position and the imminent fall of the villages of Sokol and Yevgenivka and possibly beyond that, of a number of other villages, Vovche, Progress, Lozovatska, Timofeevka, all of that, now enables the Russians to resume the advance northwards towards this road, and in effect to cut off the road. And it is this which explains the decision by the Russians. The loss of this fortified position has made it possible for the Russians to launch this attack now on Vozdvyzhenka. And with Vozdvyzhenka and the road cut, the Russians will probably also resume in earnest their advance towards Kalinovo, which is another village north of Ocheretino, north in fact of Arkhangelskoye, another village that the Russians captured some weeks ago. With Vozdvyzhenka and Kalinovo under Russian control, it won't just be difficult for the Ukrainians to maintain their supply lines and to keep their forces in places like Toretsk supplied, but that grouping in Toretsk also faces the possibility of being outflanked as well. Now, all of that is happening even as the Russians are pressing home their attack on Toretsk. Now, I've spoken about Toretsk. I've discussed a village called New York. I've looked at the maps more closely. It's clear that this is a significant urban conurbation. Toretsk itself is its core. Its population, the population of Toretsk, is said to number around 30,000. So we're talking about a significant urban settlement. And it's clear to me that New York is basically a suburb of Toretsk. Now, about a week ago, we started to receive reports that the Russians had launched an attack from Gorlovka towards Toretsk. And there's been minimal information about this attack from the Russian side, but a cascade of reports from the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians claiming at various times that the Russians had broken through and captured territory, and then contradictory reports that the Russians had in fact been thrown back and pushed back. Lots of things of that kind. Well, I think we're now getting greater clarity. It looks as if the Russians have indeed advanced towards Toretsk from Gorlovka. In other words, that they're advancing towards this major fortified position, and that they have indeed occupied significant territory in the eastern suburbs of Toretsk, including this village of Shumi. We are told, Redovka, this Russian newspaper that covers the war, says that there are only 2 Ukrainian brigades in this area because the front has been quiet for so long, and the situation with shortages of trained troops has been so great that the Ukrainians have not been able to resist the temptation to redeploy forces from Toretsk to more critical places like Chasiv Yar and Avdiivka and Kharkiv region, so that there's only around 2 brigades defending Toretsk and the whole area around Toretsk. Perhaps 8,000 men in total. If we add to these brigades various other units smaller units that probably are fighting alongside them. And Redovka says that this is not really enough to hold Toretsk against a concerted Russian offensive? Well, who knows? But anyway, it now seems that the Russians have indeed made progress in the Toretsk area. They've captured this village of Shumi. They're breaking, apparently, into Toretsk itself, or at least into its eastern suburbs, and they're increasing the pressure on the Ukrainians there. And today we got photographic and film evidence that the Russians have indeed, exactly as those reports that I discussed yesterday, that the Russians have indeed occupied a large area of territory on the eastern side of the aqueduct near Chasov Yar, north, immediately to the north of the micro-district, which, by the way, is going to make the sending of supplies to the Ukrainian troops still holding out in the western buildings of the micro-district. It's going to make it even more difficult. So, the scenario that I talked about a couple of programs ago, that the Russians seem to be working towards creating some kind of major encirclement operation in the area between Chasov Yar to the east and Pokrovsk to the west. It's beginning to look as if it's that this assumption is beginning to look not only as if it might be true, but I've noticed that more and more commentators are starting to acknowledge it. The Military Summary Channel, for example, is now speaking about the emergence of the outlines of a cauldron that is starting to appear in this very area. Now, it's important to say that when we discuss this huge battle, and it really needs to be understood as one big battle that's taking place, which is being coordinated by the Russian command from their main headquarters in Rostov. When we talk about this huge battle, we tend to talk about various different isolated parts of it. So we talk about the fighting that's going on north of Novo-Alexandrovka and Vozdvyzhenka. We talk about the capture of this fortified position north of Sokol, and we talk about the potential advance of the Russians towards the village of Kalinova, north of Arkhangelskoye, and we also talk about the fighting in Toretsk and the fighting in Chasov Yar, and by the way, Klishevka as well. But when you actually zoom out on a map, you can see very quickly how all of these various places actually interconnect with each other fairly closely. There are tens of kilometers of distance between all of these places, but we're talking about places that are perhaps separated in some cases by, shall we say, an hour's drive on a metal road. So it sounds like a more complicated battle over a vaster area than it really is. It's increasingly clear that what we're talking about is a single battle in central Donbass, where all of the various component parts are now starting to interconnect with each other, where all of the various groups of forces, Russian groups of forces, are working alongside each other, and where one gets the sense increasingly that there is a single concerted plan that they are all working in unison to execute. Now, it ought to be said that this is a horrendous battle, and in terms of the casualties, both in men and material, that it is inflicting on the Ukrainians. Now, yesterday I spoke about how the Ukrainian military, according to the Russians, lost 13,740 men over the course of the previous week. Well, this level of appalling losses has continued. The latest fighting that's just been taking place in Ukraine, along the line of contact, the very latest battle, over the latest period of fighting, the fighting that took place on the 22nd of June, yesterday, the Ukrainians, according to the Russians, lost over 1,800 men dead and wounded across the line of contact. And again, if you go to the Russian Defense Ministry, you see that the vast bulk of these men that the Ukrainians have lost, dead and wounded, are in this area of this great battle that is playing out between roughly Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka and Chasiv Yar. We don't see it as a single battle, but that is what it is. Even if a final cauldron does not fall, and one must assume, by the way, that it won't, that as the supply lines start being cut, even Zelensky and Syrskyi will understand that some sort of a retreat is essential and that they will pull the troops back, presumably to Kramatorsk, before it happens. But even if the ultimate disaster for Ukraine of a cauldron is averted, already the losses Ukraine is suffering as a result of this battle are horrendous and much greater than Ukraine can absorb. Anyway, we'll have to wait and see how this battle plays out over the next couple of weeks. And given its scale and complexity, it is a battle which almost by definition is going to last several weeks. Now, I'm going to return briefly to the question of Western policy, because the Russians have again been repeating from President Putin down their belief that at some point over the next few weeks, months, or perhaps early next year, the Western powers will finally decide that the time has come to ask Zelensky to go, or if he does not go, to relieve him of his position as president of Ukraine. Well, of course, no one in the West is talking about removing Zelensky at the moment. But we are seeing more and more reasons why this might be the case. Take again this business of the ATACMS missiles. How the Ukrainians, whenever they're given anything, they invariably come back and start demanding more. Infinite numbers of Patriot air defense missiles, permission to launch ATACMS missiles against targets deep inside Russia, refusal to acknowledge any limitations or constraints or separate interests on the part of the West, demands for unlimited funding, as discussed by Ian Proud in his latest piece on his blog, which I discussed yesterday, so that Ukraine is now spending twice as much as it receives from taxes, with huge budget deficits and huge trade deficits, which it expects to be covered by the West, even as it runs up ever bigger debts. And all this, even as Ukraine insists that the West must continue to support Ukraine as it pursues its most extreme maximalist goals. There doesn't seem to be any acknowledgement in Ukraine that Western countries might have interests that differ from their own. On the contrary, we read article after article now appearing in the Western media. This was the ones in Time magazine, the two in the Financial Times. I believe there have been others also. Article after article appearing about how Zelensky is becoming messianic, delusional, paranoid. These are all words, by the way, that have appeared in these self-same articles. And we've seen also what a disastrous figure he is in global diplomacy. Now, I made some very, very hard comments about the summit meeting, the so-called Peace Summit meeting in Switzerland that took place earlier this month. Pretty much all the same points as the ones that I've made have been made by Owen Matthews, a writer for The Spectator, and in fact this article has appeared in The Spectator, about what a complete failure this peace summit was, how it backfired disastrously. Now, I should say that Owen Matthews is someone who has a completely different perspective to the war than mine. He is a fervent supporter of Ukraine, a fierce opponent of President Putin's, a person who sees President Putin's intentions in the most, he perceives them in the most, as being, in the most sinister terms. He is somebody, as I said, whose overall perspective, both of the causes of the war, of Ukraine's cause in the war, of President Zelensky himself, I suspect, of what the West should do, well, it's all pretty much diametrically opposite to my own. And here we have, this is what Owen Matthews says. He says, Zelensky's peace, this is in The Spectator, Zelensky's peace summit flop. Ukraine's allies are running out of patience. And it goes on to say Vladimir Zelensky's, notice that it's Vladimir Zelensky's global peace summit in Switzerland. So it's now essentially acknowledged that it wasn't the Swiss who were really organising this summit. It was the Ukrainians, specifically Zelensky himself. Vladimir Zelensky's global peace summit in Switzerland was meant to demonstrate the world's support for Kiev and underscore Russia's isolation. It did the opposite. Russia wasn't invited. China didn't send a delegation. Other major countries that might influence the Kremlin, Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and the UAE, refused to sign the watered-down final communique. According to a former senior member of Zelensky's administration, one would love to know who that person is, by the way. Notice that this is a former senior member of Zelensky's administration. Ukraine's leader had hoped the conference would mark a new benchmark of international support, but, and this is now a direct quote, it showed how badly we, that is to say the Ukrainians, have lost the support of the global south. And we're then told how disillusioned all the major leaders of the global south, and there's specific reference here to President Lula of Brazil, have become with Ukraine's conduct. And then the article says that in the end, 78 countries signed the final 4-point communique, which called for Ukraine's territorial integrity to be the basis for a future peace, down from Zelensky's original 10 points, which was supported only by the US and the EU. In fact, Owen Matthews, in my opinion, is miscounting. I think it's just 76 countries. Rwanda, since I last commented on this peace summit, has also pulled out. And as I now understand it, the Patriarch of Constantinople was prevailed upon to add the Ecumenical Patriarchate's signature to the final communique as an afterthought when it became clear that the numbers were falling. So I make it just 76. Well, again, it is not surprising that this should be so, given the way in which President Zelensky mismanages international diplomacy and negotiations. So I can fully see why, given the fact that he is a failure in international diplomacy, his mismanagement of the war is leading the West into a disastrous potential situation, and all of the other many problems, I personally can very well understand and see why the Russians think that it's time for Zelensky to go, and that the Western leaders might be thinking as much. But here's the thing. I'm not certain that they are. There's been a cascade of recent articles in parts of the West talking about the so-called decline of the West. So we've had an article by Niall Ferguson, the one that makes comparisons between the end of the Soviet Union and the United States of today. We're all Soviets now. By the way, I fundamentally disagree much that he has to say about late Soviet history, but never mind. We've had an article by someone I have never come across before called Malcolm Kyeyune, making comparisons in Unheard, making comparisons between the state of America today and late revolutionary France. We've had an article by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times saying that the G7 must accept that it cannot run the world. We've had an article in Foreign Policy by Obama's former national security advisor called Ben Rhodes, saying a foreign policy for the world as it is. And we've had articles from Andreas Kluth in Bloomberg. US exceptionalism is dead no matter who wins the election in the United States. What none of these articles say, they admit that everything is going wrong and falling apart, but what none of them say is what the United States should do to reverse this situation. They come up with no policy proposals at all. Even a simple thing like, presumably, ending the rule of President Zelensky and picking up the phone and talking to Putin, which one would think would be fairly straightforward things to do. Nothing like that is being proposed. Why anybody assumes that any of this will happen, therefore, I don't know, since even those people who can see that there are problems can't come up with answers to them. We get continued drift towards escalation instead, with the ATACMS missiles about to be launched ineffectively against Russian territory. Well, I'm not going to say more, not in this programme. It's gone on long enough. Let me finish by saying again that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X, that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and don't forget to check out our shop and get your Football 24 t-shirt along with the other great things. Lastly, if you've liked this video, remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. But this is where this programme ends. Have a very good day.